Welcome to Rooting for You, a seasonal gardening podcast for non-experts. I'm Tess, and I know nothing.
And I'm Alyce, and I know some things.
Each week we'll chat about one gardening topic and then discuss the effort-reward payoff by asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Just a heads up, there might be a bit of swearing in this episode. You've been warned. A couple of weeks ago we spoke about perennial herbs or year-round herbs that just stay in the ground all year round. Now this week we're talking about annual herbs, the other kind of herbs that I assume don't stay in the ground all year round. We don't need to bang on again about how bloody fantastic growing your own herbs is. It saves money, it saves waste, it saves transport on moving your herbs around. And there's no doubt that herbs are the best addition to any meal. But unlike our year-round herbs, here we're going hard and fast and we're getting out of there. So Alyce, let's start with a list here. What kind of herbs are we talking about?
We are talking about basil, coriander, parsley, and dill. These are our classic annual herbs. And actually, before this episode, I was trying to think, we don't want to say annual herbs, so what are we going to call these? And I so love the stay in the ground all year round perennials. I had written down hard and fast herbs too. So I think we may be on to something here. Renaming annual herbs, the hard and fast quad, basil, coriander, parsley, and dill.
Love it. Are they all springtime herbs?
Well, actually, basil and dill, yes, but coriander and parsley can handle the cold weather, so we can grow them through winter as well. So I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on, but actually at the moment being spring, we can grow all four should we want to.
So I'm interested in parsley because I have a little parsley in a pot that's been there for probably about a year now.
Oh, you're touching on the one thing that I was like, do I mention this? Do I not mention this? Parsley is a very strange plant called a biennial. Biennial. So it's not an annual in the true sense, like a tomato or a zucchini or a bean, but it's also not a perennial like your rosemary. It's kind of in between and will go for up to 2 years. So as long as that parsley is happy and hasn't gone to seed and is doing its thing, great, leave it in for as long as you can, but it won't go forever.
Okay, and once it goes to seed, that's it, we're done. Get it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Because once it goes to seed, the plant is going to put all its energy into seeds and you're not going to have any leaves left. So obviously with parsley, it's the leaves that we want. So as soon as the plant's not producing leaves anymore, it's, from a culinary perspective, not that helpful to us. From a beneficial insects, from food for bees, there's other benefits to the seeds, but probably from what we're talking about, it's not useful anymore.
And if space is premium for you, then time to move on.
Absolutely. Now, I don't love growing these hard and fast herbs as much as I love our stay in the ground all year round because it is a bit more effort. We are having to plant them every 6 months or every year to keep the harvest up. It's exactly like the beans, the zucchinis, the pumpkins, the tomatoes. We put them in, they go great guns, they give us a good harvest, but then they're going to die and we're back to square one again. The only reason that, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I think they're worth persisting with even from a beginner gardener is they're actually very easy to grow. They're easy to grow from seed. They're very quick to establish, so they're actually going to grow a lot faster than your bush of rosemary or your bush of sage will, again with that hard and fast term. And also, I just love parsley. That would be my favourite herb, so I will persist with it purely because I want to eat it. And basil is one of those ones that really doesn't keep very well, I find, once you buy it. So
No.
to be able to just get some from the garden, I feel like every dish almost can just do with some fresh parsley.
So I have some little basil seeds in my greenhouse at the moment.
Excellent. Have they come up as in they've now germinated in their little seedlings?
They have.
Fabulous.
And truth be told, and I don't want to divert on this conversation for this week's topic, but I'm having a little bit of mixed results with growing from seed in my greenhouse. But basil is one of the ones that is all of the seeds that the little pots that I put them in, they've all germinated.
That's fantastic. And I'm not surprised to hear that because herbs are, as I said, really easy from seed. So if there was something to try, I would say go with, the parsley, the dill, the basil. But at the same time, they are readily available in nurseries quite cheap. So even if you still aren't enthusiastic about the seeds, they're very easy to come by in both options, so to speak. So I feel like everyone can kind of give this a go. But yeah, I'm not surprised that the germination went well. The key with something like basil is it needs warmth. So by you doing it in spring in that greenhouse, it's just given it that little warm, happy environment. And, the results show because you've got 100% germination pretty much. So you pick your herb out of the four, and then you'll either start it from seeds like you have, or you'll buy a seedling, and then you're going to plant it out. You can actually, especially with these herbs, if you had a pot that you were going to grow your basil in or your parsley in, you can just seed it in the pot. So fill your pot with soil, make a few little holes, chuck some seeds in, and then you're just raising it in situ. So what's called direct sowing. You don't have to have it in the greenhouse situation separately. I mean, there's pros and cons for this, which we've discussed in great detail in our container sowing versus direct growing episode. But herbs are one of the ones that will be quite happy direct sown, whereas some plants are a bit more fussy and don't like the direct sow as much.
Okay.
So however you get to a seedling, you've got a seedling. Where are you going to plant it? These herbs all are quite happy in pots. So if pots are your thing, that's brilliant. Kind of tuck them in different spots in the garden. I've also had success growing all of these inside on a sunny windowsill.
Ah.
So that was a question you asked in the year-round herbs episode, and I kind of diverted from it because I don't think the year-round herbs do that well inside. But basil, parsley, coriander, dill, all of them, yeah, I've grown on. It has to be quite a sunny windowsill. Like you need some decent morning sun or afternoon sun on that windowsill, but you can absolutely do it. So even if you're in an apartment, even if you don't have a single outdoor area, this would be something edible that you can grow yourself.
And what about directly into the garden bed?
Excellent question. Some people will do a dedicated herb bed in their garden. I'm not so much a fan of that. I mean, if you want to do that, go for gold. But what I usually do is I spread my annual herbs out throughout the veggie patch. And I kind of tuck them in corners where I've got other things in the garden bed as well. So right now I've got a lot of my garden beds are 2.4 metres by 1.2 metres. And in that I've got 4 tomato plants. And they're kind of on the diagonal throughout the bed. And what I'll do is kind of in the pockets in between those tomato plants, I'll dot some basil around, or I'll dot some parsley around. So there's kind of always corners or dead space in your veggie beds. And because the herbs are quite small, they are kind of happy just dotted in the corner. They're not as fussy as some of our other plants. The other good thing about that is herbs make excellent companion plants. Now, this is not something we've talked about on the podcast, but I think it will deserve its own episode in the future. But what this principle is in gardening is different plants work really well planted together, because some pests are put off by certain plants and some beneficial insects are attracted by certain plants. So by pairing plants together that work in synergy in this way, it's a natural form of pest control. With tomatoes, some of the pests that are attracted to tomatoes and may cause us problems in the garden are repelled by basil.
I was going to say, I've heard that tomato and basil are best friends in the garden.
They are, and it's probably the most iconic duo in the garden, for want of a better term, because they are, there's synergy in the kitchen with tomato and basil. I mean, they're often paired together, and there's also that same synergy extends into the garden. And actually, there's a lot of companion planting combos that surprisingly are culinary combos as well. It seems to...
They're lifelong friends.
They are lifelong friends. So by putting the basil in between my tomato plants, I'm saving space, and we're all about, making the most of the space we've got. And my tomatoes are actually going to benefit from having the basil there. The other thing is often with these companion planting combos, the soil or the conditions that one plant likes, the other plant likes. So basil and tomato both like full sun, really moist soil. So by keeping them together, it means that they're both going to be happy campers in the garden. So that's what I usually do with these type of annual herbs.
When we're planting the companion plants, so in this case the basil with the tomato, do we need to think about sunlight and potential? Obviously, a tomato plant's heaps bigger than the basil plant. Casting shade over the basil if they're both like direct sun, or is it not really that big a deal?
It is. No, it definitely is a deal in the start, but kind of by the time that the tomato plant has turned into that monster, the basil is already quite established. And at that point, it's usually also the height of summer, and the basil's kind of happy with a bit of shade from the tomato at that point. But when they're young, it is important for the basil to get a decent amount of sun. So if you tried planting the basil midsummer when the tomatoes are already huge, you're absolutely right. The shade factor would kill the system. So you have to kind of time it right. But it kind of works naturally in the sense that spring is the time to plant your basil and spring is the time to plant your tomatoes. So you will naturally probably time these at the appropriate time. So with the companion planting, you can Google lists and charts of, what's good together. And there are a few combos that actually aren't good together. Not many. I mean, I don't think it's like a make or break, ruin your veggie garden situation, but a lot of the companion planting combos involve herbs. So it is a decent thing to check out when you're thinking, oh, where am I going to fit that dill plant or whatever it is. So talking about the two and their need for warmth, as I said, basil and dill need the warm weather. These guys are in exactly the same family as our beans, our pumpkins, our watermelon. They're going to get planted in spring, they're going to go hard and fast with the warm weather, and then they're going to die off over winter. So if you love basil, great, but really we should only be eating it throughout the warmer seasons. So now, if you're listening to this when we've dropped this episode, is the time to plant them if you haven't already. The other thing about growing your own from seed or even from a seedling is you can actually get a lot more varieties than what we see in the supermarket. So what you see in a market or a supermarket will often be sweet basil. That's the one we all know and love, but there's actually heaps and heaps of types, including purple basils. Can't even think of any more off the top of my head, but there are quite a few varieties. But if it's the classic basil you're after, that's known as the sweet basil. So the coriander and parsley, you can absolutely grow them now, as I said at the start of the episode, but I tend to think of them more as my winter herbs. The reason this is they don't love really hot weather. What they often do when the weather's really hot is they go to seed. They bolt. So we've talked about this when we've talked about rocket, and we've talked about this when growing radishes, that these plants, as soon as the weather gets super hot, they get stressed. And when they get stressed, they know it's time to reproduce, and they reproduce through seeds. So they make seeds. They don't make leaves, which is what we want. So I find coriander and parsley are actually better planted in autumn and then enjoyed over the winter months.
Interesting. And a sunny spot again for those two in winter?
And a sunny spot in winter, yes. And when I say in winter, when you come out of winter, like spring, they'll still be happily in the ground now. So you can get quite a long harvest from those herbs. Coriander will, once it hits summer, it will bolt, it will go to seed. It's notorious for it. So you're going to lose it then. But the parsley, as you've seen and you've experienced, you might actually be able to get it through the whole of summer and into next winter to get an even longer harvest. So if you love coriander and parsley and you're desperate for some, sure, grow some in summer, but you're just not going to be harvesting it for anywhere near as long as if you had have grown it in autumn.
And if you are putting it in the ground now, would you say a less sunny spot for those two? Or is it kind of like, if it's a hot day, too bad?
Yeah, good question. No, I think the coriander, if you were doing it now, some afternoon shade on both of them actually would be beneficial. Yeah, that's a good point. In winter, I'd go absolute, like autumn to winter harvest, absolute full sun. But you're right, at the moment, they could do with a bit of shade.
Which is, if you have pots, great, because you can just move them around.
Exactly. And it's the afternoon sun that's the harshest on plants. So if you're kind of wanting to protect a plant from that heat and from that sun, give them the morning sun, but restrict their afternoon sun. So when the plant gets to the end of its life and goes to seed, we mentioned this earlier that there's not going to be leaves. So from an eating perspective, it's good to get the plant out. But we may be stepping into the intermediate gardening situation here, but hear me out. So when it goes to seed, it will make seed. And if you leave that plant in the ground for its full seed cycle, it will then drop those seeds and they'll scatter throughout your veggie patch, right? Because this is how the plant naturally does it. It drops the seeds and then it dies. If you let the plant do that, next year, your garden beds, your garden is actually full of seeds of parsley and coriander and basil. So what you'll find next spring is you're going to have weeds, and I'm using that term in inverted commas, popping up all over your garden where you haven't planted them. But these weeds are actually herbs. So you might find that you actually don't need to continue intentionally planting and growing these herbs because they're naturally going to come up. And things like a pumpkin, if you sprinkled pumpkin seeds all through the garden, that would naturally come up too. But you don't really want pumpkins just popping up everywhere because they're big and they're hard to manage and they need certain conditions. But something like a bit of basil, like if you've got a garden bed with veggies in it and a little basil pops up in the corner, you're quite happy to let it stay there and do its thing. So it's kind of the theory of like you're always going to have weeds in the garden. So if you manage them to be things you actually can happily live with, and I could happily live with some basil and parsley popping up all over the place. So by letting them go to seed, you're encouraging that cycle. Now, if you are an anal retentive organised gardener who wants your garden beds and your garden to look meticulous at all times and the thought of random plants popping up doesn't suit you, if that's you, then don't let them go to seed. But if you're happy for a bit more of a rustic situation and you might find, some parsley growing in your garden, Tess, where you've got your natives, if you did this approach with the seeds, you might find there's some parsley popping up in between your billy buttons, which, you may like. It's kind of like a less effort way of gardening. And I think herbs and edible flowers are the only things that I intentionally let go to seed for this reason, because I'm quite happy for them to pop up all over the shop. But food for thought, excuse the pun.
So what else do we need to be thinking about in terms of ongoing care for our herbs?
Nothing really. Like they're quite self-sufficient and hardy once they're going. Of course, it always comes down to the water. If they're in raised garden beds or garden beds generally, this isn't going to be a problem because you're going to be watering, your tomatoes plenty, and then your basil's going to get plenty of moisture in that. Sound like a broken record, but if they're in pots, you do need to keep the water up to them. That's really the only thing you could do wrong. They're almost completely resistant of any pests, so we don't have to worry about that. If you wanted to give them a water with a liquid fertilizer or your worm tea, that would be brilliant. They would love that, and they'd grow harder and faster and you get more herbs quicker. But that's about all we can do or we can expect or we need to do.
That's amazing. So given that they're hard and fast herbs, and we know that they're not going to be in the ground all year round, do you have any tips and tricks for kind of, once they're out of the ground, storage of them, or things that we can do so that we can continue to eat basil when it gets to winter?
Yes, absolutely. The joy of harvesting the herbs as you need them from your garden is you don't have to worry about the summer storage. But should you ever be storing herbs in the fridge kind of short term, so like a week, they're best in a plastic container with a tiny amount of airflow. So don't put them just in the veggie drawer on their own. Actually put them in a sealed container because that creates a bit more humidity. And the containers that have the bottoms of them aren't flat, they're like wavy, are actually best because then any moisture will sit in the wavy bottom and won't be touching the herbs directly. Does that make sense?
I can understand the theory, but I can't picture this wavy herb bottom Tupperware container.
It actually is. I mean, without dropping brand names, it actually is made by Tupperware. That's the one I'm thinking of. And it's very effective. So look.
But you can take that theory and use it with any container that you've got at home.
Absolutely. We just want to raise the herbs off
the bottom.
Exactly. You can even get like little racks, like tiny little plastic racks that sometimes sit in the bottom of plastic containers just as a raise up. This is absolutely not the answer to your question, but if storing them during summer, I thought that was useful. With the winter storage, I think your best friend here is pesto. So at the end of at the end of autumn, you're going to have a massive amount of basil that you're going to want to use up because you can't leave it in the garden forever because, as I said, it's going to die over winter. So making some big batches of basil pesto, I think, is an excellent way of getting through a lot of it and then being able to kind of add that pesto, that basil flavour to dishes moving forward. Or the easier way is you take your herbs and you puree them or chop them, get an ice cube container and then fill the different ice cubes with your pureed or your chopped up herbs, then fill them with oil and then put it in the freezer. Then when you need to say you're making a pasta in the middle of winter and you want to stir some basil through, you just pop out a few of these basil cubes, and then as the oil melts through your dish, and you know what dish isn't good with a bit of oil on it, or your salad or whatever, then the basil will also kind of melt and go through your dish. So that's a good way of kind of storing them and getting the flavour throughout the year in the cooler months.
Do you blend them up with the oil in the blender as well, or just herbs in the blender by themselves?
Yeah, good question. If I'm doing it in the blender, I absolutely do it with the oil. So I puree them up together. Yeah. If I'm hand chopping.
And if you don't have a blender, just chop it up?
Just chop it up and then top up with oil. Yeah. The blender's going to do a better job because you're going to get more bang for your buck as far as more herb in the ice cream cube. And I think that's easier. But without
ice cream cube, just an ice block.
Why have I got the ice cream on my mind? Just the ice cube, people. But look, failing the blender, a really good hand chop is going to do a brilliant job also.
On freezer space being premium, can you pop all your cubes out and then keep them in a plastic bag?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And in fact, that's actually a better option because what you notice with a freezer is over time flavours transfer around the joint. And if you've got something in an ice cube tray and you leave it there for months, that basil flavour and that basil oil is kind of free to roam throughout your freezer, which we don't really want. And we also don't want other things in your freezer impacting on your herbs. So anytime you freeze something in a tray or in an ice cream mould, whatever it is, and I'm saying ice cream mould intentionally this time because there's something I sell, but whenever you freeze anything in a mould, what you then want to do, if you're not going to consume it straight away, is pop it out into a sealed plastic container or a sealed Ziploc bag, and that's going to keep the flavours where we want them, not kind of mingling throughout our freezer. So yes, you're exactly right. You would not want to leave the herbs in the ice cube tray for the next 3 months.
And we're talking about basil specifically now, but all good for coriander and dill and parsley to do cubes as well in the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. I've focused on the basil because it's my favourite. But yes, you can do all them, do them all the same way. And of course you could do a mix of them. I find keeping them individual is easier because I might not want coriander in my parsley, for example. Coriander in my pasta. So I keep them separate, but you can absolutely just mix them all together and then you've kind of got some herby concoction to add when you need.
Lastly, is there anything that you can say about drying herbs, or do you really reckon that the freezing them in the ice cubes is the best way to go?
I think with these soft herbs that are the annual hard and fast herbs, I don't think any of them dry that well. I think the drying is more suited to the perennial woody herbs. So you think about like a sprig of rosemary or sage, and a thyme even, like they're quite woody And yeah, they just tend better, I think, for drying in both the ability to dry them and then their future use. So I would say woody herbs, dry. Soft herbs, freeze.
Blend them up, pop in the freezer.
Exactly.
Fabulous. So the big question, is the juice worth the squeeze? This is where we look at the effort-reward ratio of today's topic. The categories are superstar, high effort, high reward. Completing this will make you feel like an absolute rock star. Best on ground, low effort, high reward. Quick wins and fill-ins, low effort, low reward. And finally, the wooden spoon, high effort, but not much reward.
Tess, tell me, when it comes to these hard and fast herbs, is the juice worth the squeeze, and which one of them will you be planting this spring?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Because I can tell you what I won't be planting. I won't be planting dill because I hate dill. For dill for me is an absolute wooden spoon.
I love dill. I can't believe we've had this whole chat and you've just kept your secret hatred for dill private.
It ruins anything it touches. Okay, this is good. Okay, so I'm putting dill in the wooden spoon category because it's too much effort for an awful, awful taste. Everything else, parsley, particularly about parsley, what's great about it is that you can get 2 years out of it. That's really good. So for parsley, coriander and basil, they're all best on ground for me. Effort's low. They seem to be pretty low maintenance once you get them in. I really like that you can just pop them round your other kind of more big ticket item plants. They're kind of just, you're filling space with them. And I really, really like this conversation that we've just had now about prolonging having them in your kitchen by freezing them over winter. How good's that?
Yeah, exactly. And when you start growing them, the amount of basil you're going to have is going to be a lot. So you think about how much you would spend buying it throughout the season, and then you've got no access to it over winter. And now you can have it throughout all of summer and then have this glut at the end that you need to freeze so much of it. I mean, it's even got the economic benefits to it. I would say out of the 4 that we've discussed, there are actually other annual herbs, but they're less popular for consuming, so I didn't bother mentioning them. I would say dill and basil are slightly fussier than your coriander and parsley. And I would say coriander, again, has that problem of really hating the heat and bolting. Parsley is absolutely going to be best on ground number 1. If there was only one of these someone was going to grow, I would say parsley. Not only because, as you correctly pointed out, it will last in the ground for an extra amount of time, but I just find it's just so ridiculously hardy and easy. You'd be hard-pressed to kill a parsley plant.
Rooting for You is hosted by Alyce and Tess, artwork by Lauren Janine. You can find us on Instagram @rootingforyoupod or email rootingforyou@alycealexandra.com. And remember, we are rooting for you.